As a supervisor, you will need to work with the examination process in two roles. Firstly, through the submission of a thesis for examination, and secondly, by serving as an examiner for theses submitted by students from other universities. Let's begin by looking at the process of submitting a thesis for examination. Most universities allow supervisors to nominate examinations, and nominations are then approved elsewhere by some higher authority, maybe at two levels, first the faculty and finally the Senate or the Senate Executive. For the supervisor, though, a most important task is nominating the examiners. If you are invited to nominate examiners, what are the considerations that you need to bear in mind? Well, the first is that you need a spread of expertise. Depending on the thesis, it's unlikely that all examiners will have equal expertise in its methodology, its focus area, and so on. As an examiner, you need to be sure that across however many examiners are appointed, there is sufficient expertise to give the thesis a sufficiently rigorous but also a fair reading. So you might consider looking at one examiner on the basis of the fact that they do a particular kind of research, they employ a particular approach to research. That examiner may not necessarily have expertise in the topic of the thesis, the focus area of the thesis, but nevertheless they might be able to give it a fair reading, a rigorous reading, because they are experts in the methodological approach used. So when you nominate examiners, one key thing is not to think too narrowly and to think widely over all that needs to be examined in a thesis and ensure that through the examiners you have the lot covered. Consider too the experience of the examiners. We do have research which shows that novice examiners can be harder on candidates than the more experienced. Novice examiners tend to focus on whether or not a thesis is good enough, whereas the more experienced examiners start by assuming that the thesis is actually good enough, and they look forward to welcoming the new doctor into the fold. So consider a range of examiners over experience as well. Your institution may have very specific rules about who can be appointed. For example, the institution might say that no more than one examiner from a single institution can be nominated. And they might also say that at least one of the examiners might be international. So before you nominate, look up the rules, because you don't want to be turned back by the faculty and made to look as if you haven't read them. This may sound very obvious, but never ever nominate an examiner without having checked with that person that they will take the thesis and that the timeframes you are proposing are acceptable. It's actually surprising how many examiners have problems when you ask them to take a thesis for examination and you say it needs to be done by a certain date. Many of them aren't available to do it in that particular timetable for all sorts of reasons, so you need to check that. Once the thesis has been submitted for examination, then the supervisor must withdraw. You can have nothing more to do with the examination process unless, for some very particular problematic reason, the dean or whoever's in charge asks you to become involved. So withdrawal is key to the quality of the thesis and to the validity of the thesis. Unfortunately, this can mean that you feel as though you're being examined alongside the student. I certainly feel like that. And it's one of the reasons why I feel that I have to be really, really confident that the thesis will get through before I will sign that submission form. Some universities provide very general criteria for the examination of a postgraduate thesis. In others, those criteria are much more specific. As a supervisor, it's really worth bearing the criteria in mind as you work with the final drafts of the thesis. And some of the things you can consider are whether or not there are ways your student could make meeting the criteria more overt. Is there any way in the thesis itself where they could signal to the examiner that they are actually meeting the criteria? This will often be quite subtle, but it's worth working out if there are ways to do that. Perhaps another thing to consider is whether or not there's a chance that your student is meeting the criteria differently, and this needs to be signalled. Is a particular approach they've used, is that different in some way? Does it need to be signalled that this is still valid, even though it's not the most obvious approach, and so on? What it means, of course, is that you need to be very familiar with the criteria to see if you can help your student to do this. And of course, you need to alert your student to the criteria so they can join in the process and make sure that their thesis has a good chance of meeting them when it's examined, as they try to work with you to bring that thesis to completion. I've already mentioned potential disputes between students and supervisors at this stage of submitting a proposal to a higher degrees committee. Those same disputes can also arise when it becomes time to submit the thesis for examination. Students often think their work is ready for submission and you disagree. If they won't listen to you, then these disputes are best resolved through discussion by trying to explain exactly what it is you still want them to do and why it is that you need them to do it. However, there may well be cases where a student insists on submitting, regardless of the fact that you're not prepared to sign the form, that you're not prepared to say that you believe the thesis is ready for examination. If this is the case, most universities will allow this, although the fact that the supervisor hasn't agreed to the submission is not disclosed to the examiners until the examination is complete. Again, at the risk of sounding really obvious, please remember to put the thesis through Turnitin or another text matching program before submission. And when you get that report, read it sensitively. It doesn't mean that because the report says that there is a certain percentage of text matched to online sources or whatever, that the thesis is plagiarized. Turnitin reports require judgment, but using the text matching service is really important. There can be few things more embarrassing, I would think, than having an examiner identify plagiarism in a thesis that you've supervised. When the examiners submit their reports, they don't come to you, the supervisor. They usually go back to a committee or some higher authority for consideration. Find out what happens in your university if you're a novice supervisor and you haven't yet submitted a thesis for examination. All this means that by the time the examiner's reports reach you, a decision will probably have been made about the award of the degree. Universities usually offer examiners a number of options on which to base their recommendation, and these range around the following ideas. The first one is that the degree should be awarded without any changes made to the thesis at all, not even minor typos and editing changes. This is a very, very unusual outcome. It's not common at all. The second idea that universities base their criteria on is that the degree should be awarded with minor changes to the satisfaction of the supervisor, but it might also be the HOD or the dean or a faculty committee. It depends on how the university is set up. And this really is a good outcome. If the examiners recommend that the degree can be awarded with minor changes to your satisfaction, this really is a vote of confidence in you. But regardless, it means that they trust in this particular category of recommendation. They trust the university to do the work necessary to make sure that the revised thesis addresses the concerns they've raised. The next recommendation ranges around the idea that the thesis is not sufficient in its present form to meet the criteria, that it needs to be revised substantially, and that the examiners want to see it again. And this generally means that there's at least 6 months to a year's work. And then you have to go through the whole process of submission again. Finally, the category of recommendation that you really, really don't want is that the degree should not be awarded. So a higher authority within the university will generally have decided which of these recommendations to make about the award of the degree. And that often means looking at all the examiners' reports and coming to some sort of consensus, because the examiners don't always agree, and there are processes in place in universities where there are disagreements about examinations within examiners. So when you get the reports, obviously you have to share them with your students, and often the students experience reports negatively. They've put their heart and soul and years of work into this thesis, and it comes back and the examiners want changes, they're critical of it or whatever. And so they will often experience the examiners' reports very negatively. So your job, and the more experienced you are, the more you're able to fulfill this role, your job is to assuage their fears, to help them to see that the criticism offered by the examiners is actually constructive. It's aimed at getting a better product in the end. It's aimed at helping them to make the thesis better. So that's really important in the sense that the examination isn't the end of the learning process. The learning continues even when the examiner's reports come in towards the end. It's still ongoing. It's very unlikely that your student will be able to interpret exactly what the examiners want without your help. So you're going to have to sit with them and help them mediate those reports. And this can take many hours, depending on the complexity of what the examiners are saying. And it can be quite difficult to identify exactly what is being called for. If you're having difficulty understanding what the examiners are saying because you're a novice supervisor, do consider consulting colleagues on the Higher Degrees Committee or in the faculty or department. It really is worth considering this, and I certainly wouldn't believe that there was any embarrassment or shame involving asking for the help of more experienced colleagues. After you've worked with your students to try to understand the reports and identify what it is that actually needs to be done, consider getting your student to write you something saying what they think they need to do. And this is especially important if a resubmission is called for and they're going to have to make substantial changes to the thesis. Throughout this course, we've talked about writing being a tool for learning. So getting your students to write through what they think the changes are that they need to make, will actually help them to make those changes. What they write will also serve as a record of your discussion. You can check it, and you can then correct them if their understandings still aren't what you think needs to be done before they actually go ahead and make the changes. So I think this is an important step. Do remember, though, that it's not necessary to comply with all that the examiners call for. as sometimes there might be a very good reason for you not doing what they say they want you to do. Believe it or not, some examiners may not have read sufficiently carefully. They might actually have misunderstood the point that the student is making the thesis, or the way the theory has been applied, or whatever. And they may also be working from a very different perspective to the student. And in this case, arguably, perhaps they were not well chosen. And therefore, they find it difficult to see what the student was trying to do. If the call is for a resubmission, it will be necessary to explain why some of the changes are not being made in a letter to the examiners. And the examiners, if you are an examiner, obviously you need to listen to what comes back. So I think what we're saying here is that the examinations process, it's not one way. It can be a dialogue. It has to be a dialogue between you and your student as you negotiate the reports. And it can be a dialogue with the examiners if you don't agree with what they say needs to be changed. I think, though, it's often better, if this is the case, that you ask more experienced colleagues, ask other colleagues what they think before you write that letter saying that you're not going to do the changes. Let's shift now to your role if you're invited to examine a thesis. So it's not that you're submitting a thesis for examination with your student, but rather that you're being asked to examine a thesis where a study has been done at another university. Well, the invitation will usually come from the supervisor, and the supervisor might provide an abstract or tell you a little bit about the thesis. If it isn't clear to you why the supervisor is asking you, do ask. The supervisor might be able to point out areas where you do feel confident to examine. You might not really understand just from a reading of the abstract why you've been selected, so a conversation with the supervisor can be helpful in that respect. Always check the time frames. When the shoe's on the other foot and you're waiting with your student for the examiner's reports to come in, it can be awful if the examiners overrun the time allocated to them. So when you're asked to examine, when you're an examiner, you need to check that you can actually complete the examination in the time frames. If you do agree to be nominated, you will probably have to submit a CV, which then goes before the faculty or the Senate. And if they approve, you're then appointed. One thing to remember is that the pay for external examining is generally very poor. It's not going to make anyone rich. Examining a thesis is better viewed as a service to your disciplinary community. It's certainly not going to substantially increase the money you have at the end of a particular month. It is common to list the examination of a doctoral thesis on a CV, and increasingly this sort of thing can count in personal promotions processes at individual universities. VIVAS or oral examinations should be considered quite positively. They provide an additional opportunity for students to argue their case, to explain in another way what they've tried to explain in the thesis. And importantly, they also provide an opportunity to address any misunderstandings or problems identified by the examination process in person with the examiners. VIVAS or oral examinations generally come after the written examination, and they're therefore based on the examiner's report. You can really help your student to prepare for a VIVA or an oral examination by talking to them about the criteria the examiners will have used to do the written examination. Check that they've read their thesis again before the oral. And once they've done this, get them to identify areas where they think the examiners might have some concerns or where they think the examiners might ask questions. and, of course, get them to imagine what they would say to these questions or concerns. Finally, on the day of the VIVA or oral examination, try to make sure that you're there to offer reassurance before the event. It can be extremely nerve-wracking for students to have to walk into a room to be examined orally. And hopefully, you'll still be there to celebrate afterwards.